This podcast was produced on the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung and Kulin Nation and recorded on Kulin land. We acknowledge the Yarrah and Wurundjeri people as the traditional owners and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Particularly if someone's making their debut for a country, say like with the Pararoos, I had to do some of that, which is Australia's men's cerebral palsy team, and the women's team, the Paramatildas as well, who are amazing, by the way. I had some amazing moments where players were making their debuts or scoring their first goal, and you have to put the work in because that's a massive moment for them. I had, families of some of the players come up to me and say, thank you for being the background. Like, it's his first game, first goal, and it's so humbling to hear things like that. And that's why you do it. You do it not only for the players themselves, but also for, if that then resonates with somebody, then it's an absolute bonus.
Listening to The State of the Fourth Estate, where we get to know the people behind the news, discuss the state of the industry and what it takes to be a journalist. I'm Tayla Oates.
And I'm Sura Mishra.
And here to discuss the state of the Fourth Estate, Oliver Walker-Peel, a sports journalist and soccer or football commentator who was dubbed the voice of the International Federation of Cerebral Palsy Football Asia-Oceania Championships after his commentating work for the SBS. He worked as an audio description commentator at the Women's FIFA World Cup in 2023 and also has covered several local games. Welcome.
Thank you, Tayla. Thank you for having me.
That is quite
a mouthful. I was waiting for the thing to sort of end.
No,
the inhale of breath.
Tell us, how did you get started?
So commentary was always the thing I wanted to do after I grew up and decided that I couldn't be an athlete, which obviously we'll get onto why later on. I sort of decided to go into broadcasting, and I was friends with the president of my local soccer team, Mornington Soccer Club, and they said, hey, we're looking for a commentator. We know you like to talk. Would you like to do it? And that was in 2019, the year before the pandemic, and I was 15 at the time, and they just said, do all our home games for us. We'll do it for radio. It won't even go out on the main radio broadcast. It will just go out to like the side channel, whatever, for highlights. And the rest is history, I suppose.
What a door-opening moment for you.
Yeah.
Why soccer, though?
Well, I mean, the accent's the half of the giveaway, isn't it?
Yeah.
I was born in Manchester, north of England, and I lived in a town called Blackburn. I lived next door on the estate of the training ground of my favourite football club. And I also grown up in a family that's pretty mad on football. My dad used to play professionally. And so I was sort of in and around that environment. And once I came to terms with cerebral palsy and what that was and realised that I couldn't be a footballer, couldn't play, I then found another way to access a sport I love, and that came through talking about it and waffling about it for 2 hours every weekend. There's a number of other sports I love as well, but football is the one that feels like home.
And so, because you're English, it's football, not soccer.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's what we're sticking to, football.
Well, I'm not going to fight people who say soccer, because I understand that there is a very prevalent other football code in this state that I also quite love as well.
Let's backtrack a little bit. For sports noobs, what's the difference between sports reporting and sports commentary?
I've said in the past that a commentator is also a journalist at heart, so I think commentary is encompassed in the all-umbrella term of sports reporting.
That's great, because we were discussing, is it under the umbrella of the Fourth Estate and the journalism industry? So you strongly believe that. Is that a common belief amongst sports journalists and commentators?
Commentators are journalists because they have to report what's going on. They do it in a different style to what most traditionally see as reporting, the whole print and that side of things, but it's the same.
Absolutely. Back in the day, sports games were also on the radio. I don't know if they still are.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
I've done a few games for radio. You're not wrong, actually, for not knowing that football isn't on the radio, because there isn't football broadcast on the radio over here. The Matildas games recently, they were the first games on radio in a few months because the local league, the A-League men's over here that was traditionally done by SEN, they lost the rights and nobody's picked them back up. So football's not really much on radio over here, but in England that's more of a thing. Of course, you'd listen to that, and I've grown up with that. Like, so many people's happy place might be the beach, or no, to me it's freezing in a 2-degree football stadium halfway across the world.
I mean, you got the accent for it. So, a recent piece of work, you covered the IFCPF Championship last year for SBS.
It is about more than football and always will be. As Nepal a chance here for the opening goal of their tournament. And in their history, Panjana Dami writes her name into Nepalese footballing history. She's worked so hard for that. And look how much it means. It's 14-1, but that one means so much.
How do you best prepare for something like this?
I'll have 5 or 6, 7 pages of commentary prep. And so I'm doing a game this weekend. I was doing it all of the morning that we're recording this, and it took me a couple of hours, and I'd done some of the work beforehand. Usually if I'm starting from scratch, it'll take me 7 or 8 hours to prepare for a game, which sounds like a lot, but it's what you need. There was a famous English commentator, Peter Drury, who said you've got to do 100% of the prep because you don't know what 10% you're going to need. So you've got to have the 100% so you can pick which 10% you're going to use, or maybe you never use it at all, but you've got to have it all.
Yeah, wow, and you got 7 or 8 pages there. What's on those pages?
So the way I tend to do it, I'll have a first page, which will be the 2 teams. I'll have screenshots of their faces, all the profiles where they've played, date of birth, and I'll have like some miscellaneous stats on the game, say lineups from the previous week, form, what position they're on the table, and then I'll have that sheet copied again but in larger form, and then the other team's sheet, so I'll have a double page spread in a book where I can look at them all and read everything, and then I'll have like stats from previous years, stats from previous games that they've played between each other. There's a lot. There's a hell of a lot. It's honestly, as someone who commentates, it's one of the most fun things is having a really nicely organised prep sheet. I don't even
You're
know
a
what
massive dork.
Yeah, I sound like it, but like some of it's really hard because sometimes you're commentating. So I've commented, like I said, at the Women's World Cup. So you've got like all these stats from the WSL and previous World Cups, and then this weekend it's like you're commentating a 17-year-old from Oakley who's playing his first game. They're as rewarding as each other because, you know, particularly if someone's making their debut for a country, say like with the Pararoos, I had to do some of that, which is Australia's men's cerebral palsy team and the women's team, the Paramatildas as well, who are amazing, by the way. I had some amazing moments where players were making their debuts or scoring their first goal, and you have to put the work in because that's a massive moment for them. I had, you know, families of some of the players come up to me and say thank you for being the background. Like, it's his first game, first goal, and it's so humbling to hear things like that. And that's why you do it. You do it not only for the players themselves, but also for, if that then resonates with somebody, then it's an absolute bonus.
I think it creates such an environment when you're watching a sports game hearing the commentator. It creates momentum and pace to the game as well. I think sports would be so boring without our commentators. So it is really that, like, cherry on top. I do like sports, I swear. So let's talk specifically about CP football. So you mentioned that cerebral palsy football is quite popular. What is cerebral palsy football for someone who hasn't heard?
Well, it's coming popular now. This tournament really helped that the men's and women's Asia Oceania Championships, or Para Asian Cup as Football Australia decided to market it, which was a tournament that was held in Melbourne in November. But cerebral palsy football is 7-a-side, and there's a few rules in there as well, like there's no offsides, smaller pitches, smaller goals. It's 5-a-side for the women's game. So during the tournament in Melbourne, they played it at the home of the Matildas that was recently built, and so you'd have like the men's pitch would be like a white outlined pitch, and you'd have the blue women's pitch on the inside. And when you actually compare the size of them, because they're inside one another, the women's pitch is actually really, really small, which creates a lot of goals, and it's great fun.
This has kind of just been like sleeping below the surface for a really long time. Why is football so popular with people with cerebral palsy?
I think football's so popular because football is a game that anybody can play. You look at a sport like cricket, you need a ball, you need stumps. With football, you can throw down a couple of jumpers, get a circular ball, kick it around, and you're away. You don't need any particular equipment, and I think that's the same in cerebral palsy football as well. It's quite accessible. There's state setups and national setups for people to get involved with the game. People can now watch the Paramatildas and the Pararoos on SBS and on a national broadcaster.
Has that exposure to para-athlete sports open media's eyes to these kind of events and games?
You look at the Paralympics as well, which is obviously something that I've watched a lot of because obviously I feel represented. Having those things kind of on the telly or on media where people can see it is massively important. hugely important, to the point where a young lad with cerebral palsy come up to me and just say, look, I want advice, can we jump on a call and talk about it? So sometimes some of the stuff that I've done commentating on cerebral palsy football, or even commentating on able-bodied football, has transcended across. People are now going on 10play online and on SBS On Demand, but yeah, people are now going, we can do this now, we can see it now, and that's really important for not only just me but also fellow people with a disability to go, all right, we can do this now.
So earlier you mentioned that you have cerebral palsy. Can you tell us a little bit about how that's affected yourself and also how it's affected your work as a journalist?
Well, it has. Cerebral palsy has opened doors for me, but of course having cerebral palsy isn't the easiest thing to have to deal with and grapple with. I remember going through a couple of times in my life where I was like, why does it have to be me? Like, nobody else around me has got it. You know, my family don't have it. It's not a genetic thing. Cerebral palsy, just for anybody who doesn't know and is unacquainted, it's contracted at birth, and there's a number of reasons why you might get it. It's not genetic, so you don't pass it down. It's something that's unique to the person, and you can't cure it. And it's amazing. Like, I wouldn't be the same person without it. I wouldn't be in the places where I am. I'm happy with it. But you're effectively, for lack of a better term, stuck with it. Again, that was quite hard for me to deal with, my family to deal with. One of my favourite things to do outside of commentate is to prove some people wrong. If somebody tells me that I can't do something and I reckon I can do it, then I'm going to give it a shot. Apparently, when I was going into hospital, I was 2 years of age, and I got told I would never walk. And again, that is something that's been passed down, but I've got some sources who were there at the time who'd passed it on. But, you know, I can walk. I can, sometimes slowly, but I can do it. And that's it. It's like, you go and try and prove people wrong. It's something I love to do. There's different subcategories to cerebral palsy. So my subcategory is spastic diplegia. Cerebral palsy is a brain injury, so it affects your brain, but it can affect the rest of your body in different ways. So spastic diplegia, di meaning 2, affects both of my legs. So there'll be some people with cerebral palsy who are affected straight down your body, like left side, right side. Mine is sort of horizontally. Upper body is, what do you say, operational? Fully operational?
A-OK.
Left, lower side of the body, slightly less so, to put it politely. It's a wide umbrella term, much like the fourth estate is, but it affects so many people in so many different ways. And so I'm proud of having it. I wouldn't be the same person without it. And it took me a long time to sort of embrace it, but I think it's something you kind of have to do.
And what is the importance of embracing that? Again, not only for you personally, but also in your career as a commentator and a journalist.
It was something that I wanted to hide. I didn't want people to know that I had cerebral palsy, which, looking back on, it's something I regret so much. I had a feature with the AFL, and they said, look, we like your work, we want you to come on. And I got asked beforehand, do you want to talk about your cerebral palsy? And I said, no, I don't. Because I kind of, in my mind, what was going through my mind was like the X Factor, Australia's Got Talent. I sort of didn't want that to become a sob story. I hate the fact that I thought like that. And I did an interview 2 months later and talked about it, because it's a huge part of who I am.
How can this field be made more accessible for other sports commentators who have cerebral palsy?
You can't be what you can't see. And I don't want to sound big-headed or anything, but if I can get through, get right to the top, and help people with cerebral palsy, I would love it. Like, I'm many things. Right? I'm someone who could talk for England, I'm a commentator, I'm a student, but I also want to be an advocate. I also want to be someone who talks about disability and maybe helps somebody who is really struggling with it. There are some places that I've commentated from that weren't the most accessible, so just even like general accessibility things. Getting rid of scaffolds for commentators, because that still happens and that's quite hard to deal with at some certain grounds. There are some grounds I just now won't go to because they're scaffolds and ladders and all this kind of thing. So just even like general accessibility things, wherever possible, could help people get there.
My two-pronged question is, do you find that there are things that you kind of have to be mindful of and change to be able to do your work? And how does that affect your ability to do the work?
Having a disability where my lower limbs are the most affected, sometimes I stand up and I don't have time to sit back down again. And so sometimes I'll then stand up, and then after the game's done, I'll be like, oh my goodness, my legs are killing. And there's not really much I can do about it. So sometimes just sitting down at a break works. I'm very rarely on camera. So if you were to tune in without knowing who I am and just hear my voice, you'd have no idea that I've got cerebral palsy, which in some ways is brilliant. In other ways, it's not. while disabilities are different, everybody with a disability is different, there was kind of similar eye-opening moments for me. It came from a guy who plays for the Pararoos, the men's team for people with CP, brain injury or stroke, a guy called Ben Roach. So my dad helped set up a football club in Mount Martha, where I'm from and still living, and he came down to one of the sessions. I'm like, there's somebody there who plays football like me, plays for Australia. That was the first point where I realised I could be something. If I was to ask somebody to name somebody with cerebral palsy and you couldn't say me, like if I was asking you two on the other side of the table, name somebody with cerebral palsy, it might be quite hard. There's not many other people that I knew before that. In fact, there might not have been any if I knew. But to have somebody there was incredible. And of course I didn't then go on to play because I wanted to do something else. I got the chance to then broadcast, and again, it's just brilliant kind of seeing yourself and then also being on the other side of it too, trying to maybe inspire the next generation. And if I am someone perhaps to get somebody else involved, that'd be incredible.
It's vital to see yourself in these roles. And we saw that with the surge of having people of colour in film. We've seen it lately in the Oscars, where there's more and more people of colour who are winning Oscars and awards, and they finally get to have that moment on the stage and to have that representation. It's amazing.
It's wonderful to see women or people with colour or people who maybe identify as LGBTQ+. I hope I've got all the acronyms right. There we go. But whoever it is, like whoever you are, it's nice to see people break in. It's awesome to see like the amount of women I've now worked with in commentary particularly. There's a couple of really, really talented female broadcasters who I've had the opportunity to work with, and all power to whoever wants to give it a go.
What has been your experience with diversity in journalism, and do you find that they kind of assign, for a better word, you to the parasports because of your disability?
Well, I got the job originally commentating on the Pararoos because of Ben Roach, the guy I was talking about before. He said, listen, we know you can commentate, we want you to do this game. I went and did it, and I was part of the first all cerebral palsy commentary team for a football game ever, for a game to be nationally broadcast.
That is very cool.
There was 3 of us, so there was me and 2 other former Pararoos. By that sort of sample size, you sort of think, well, there is a commonality there. We all have cerebral palsy, but to a point, we also kind of understand what it is to have cerebral palsy. Of course, there's many different types of cerebral palsy, but we all understand what that's like. And so we have a stake in it because we know a little bit of what some of these athletes have gone through. That felt special to be part of a team of all cerebral palsy athletes commentating on cerebral palsy football. But back to the whole diversity point, it is, I would say that so many of my favourite experiences commentating sport, working in sport, have been women's sports. At the centre of it, the AFLW and the Women's World Cup and the Women's Para-Asian Cup. There's been so many chances I've had to work alongside women particularly who are doing an insane job, and it's wonderful to see. There's plenty I could name. I could sit here for hours and name some of my favourites. In fact, I may as well. Samantha Lewis, who I haven't worked with, is incredible, a journalist. Taryn Hedo, another one who's a journalist and a commentator in football. Gemma Bastiani is someone who does AFLW and VFL Men's, VFL Women's, who is incredible. Her and Lucy Watkin have done a wonderful bit of work together, and they're trying to get female commentators through as well. Pakua Frimpong is someone who I've worked very closely with in a number of roles, and I think coming soon they've got the first weekend of a league that's all commentated by women. So the A-League Women's, it's this weekend, I'm pretty sure, as we record this. All of the games have women commentators. Yeah, bring it on.
Bring it on. Hell yeah.
It's important to understand what sports journalism is about. What place do you think sports journalism has in the society from a cultural perspective and also from a political perspective compared to, say, how we talk about regular journalism being like a watchdog of democracy?
It's ever-changing, particularly given how radio is kind of being phased out. Of course, radio was the start of sports commentary and sports broadcasting, really. And I love the fact that radio still exists. And I'm championing so much for radio to stay around, because not only is it a wonderful avenue to sort of listen to games and call games, it's such a skill to be able to do it. And of course, sports media is changing in the same way that many other forms of media are, in terms of we're going away from grabbing maybe the Herald Sun on a Sunday morning from the local newsagent to reading it online. And again, a lot of the sports stuff is done online. Australia culturally is a very sport heavy country, where in winter you can go down to the pub and watch the Aussie rules, or go to the G and watch the cricket. And Boxing Day, you've got public holidays for the day before the AFL Men's Grand Final. Like, it's a sport-heavy country, and so culturally, there will always be a place for sports media. Is it going to be the same in 10 years? I was listening to a podcast of Victorian commentators who work in the league that I work in, who were satirically saying that commentary will be replaced by AI soon. And look,
Scary.
it was satirical, but there might have been something behind it. I would hope not, but that's the way the world's going, and it's kind of exciting to not know where it's heading, because you get to be a part of change and see a new world.
Cultural shock when I first came to Australia, realizing that Australia had holiday for sports finals, and I still don't understand it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, England, particularly with football, where I'm from, England is crazy for football. We don't have any public holidays. Like, you can hardly go into an English town centre and not hear football be mentioned once. England and football are so intertwined. But over here we've got public holiday the day before the AFL Men's Grand Final and a public holiday for the Melbourne Cup.
We were promised one if the Tildas won, but they did not. So what's really interesting is in my job, I work in radio and I'm a news reader. I have to report sports. I'm not a super sporty person and I don't totally understand every sport. But what do you think about the fact that like pretty much every journalist now has to become somewhat of a sports journalist? And what threat does that kind of bring positions for you?
The best reporters and best journalists are the versatile ones who can maybe specialise in music or politics, for example, but can also hold a conversation about sport. Whereas I'm not great on politics, I'm not great on music, but I can talk about sport. Well, I would say to embrace it. Again, I'm someone who has written for 2 sports publications, and the only time that I haven't really written on sport is when I've done it for uni. But just embrace challenges, because you're going to be put in some really uncomfortable positions. Even within sport, I've been nervous going to a game or reporting on a game, and that's something I'm really comfortable in. I still get nervous. My advice, start as early as you can. Whether it's reporting on something you want to report in or not, get started as early as you can, put yourself out to the world. I put myself out there really early and got a lot of people who maybe weren't a fan of the stuff I was doing, and people can have their opinions. I've had a lot of comments say, get away from our Australian game, and that. Some of those were ridiculously funny. It's all about accepting that some of them may be a laugh, some of them maybe not, but then again, that's what it is. You put yourself out there, you develop a bit more of a resistance to those kind of things. Not everybody's going to like you. Not everybody's going to like the stuff you're doing. But if your employer, if your boss, or potential idols of yours maybe who've looked at your work saying, yeah, you're doing really well, keep going. That's what matters.
I think I needed to hear that. Thank you.
Always here for life advice. Always here for life advice.
While researching for this episode, I realized that sports journalism was quite active. You have to report on what's happening right in front of you. Whereas when you're, say, doing something for broadcast media or radio or even writing, you have some time to, think about what you're writing. Have you noticed a similar or different approach to this?
There's a big difference for me between commentary broadcasting and journalism, like article writing. On a sports commentary, particularly for radio, you have got seconds, if that, to come up with what you've got to say. And you've got to get it right. Let's go with the Matildas, for example. Let's say that the semi-final, 12 million people watched that, half of the country watched that. Sam Kerr's incredible goal. And if I had said that Courtney Vine scored that goal from 40 yards and not Sam Kerr, it's misinformation, it's incorrect, I might have done it accidentally, but you've got in your mind an entirely different picture of what's going on. So not only have you got to be quick and you've got to think on your feet and think on the go, you've also got to be correct. Because as a commentator, you pride yourself on identifying the right players to give the people at home, particularly on radio, who are listening in and can't see it, the right idea of what's going on. So it's kind of strange that the difference between those two and how to compare radio broadcasting to your print, if you like, is the time constraints. Definitely feels a little bit of a hotter kitchen, definitely in front of a microphone.
Oh, for sure. We were talking about how that feels sitting behind a live mic earlier. And for the FIFA World Cup in 2023, Matilda's played, you were an audio description commentator. So do you mind telling us a little bit about what the difference between that and, say, regular commentating is?
Audio descript commentary is for people who are visually impaired or have blindness and so can't see what's going on. And the uneducated part of me went there saying, it'll be just like radio commentary, maybe a step up. But we were very quickly informed that it's more than one step up. You've got to explain exactly where the ball is, exactly which team has it, exactly which way they're going, end to end. We had a whole 20-minute pre-game where we had to say, and it's Nigeria playing in green shorts, green shirts and green socks and Canada where we're wearing a maple leaf shirt. You had to explain all of that. That was like a whole 20-minute, half an hour pre-game, and then you got into the actual game where you had to pinpoint exactly where the ball was. You had to think on your feet. You had to be so descriptive of the game. You had even less time than usual to think about what you were going to say. One of the games I did was the Sweden-USA match. I don't know if you remember, it was one of the craziest games in the tournament. One that went to penalties, and the penalty from Sweden that eventually won the game, the USA goalkeeper thought she'd saved. I was on that game with Michael Schiavello, who's a MMA commentator, and so my voice after that game, after 120 minutes, and also the chaos of not knowing what was going on, was gone. Absolutely gone. And that was the thing, I'm trying to make sure my voice doesn't break while explaining to, in an audio descript manner what's going on. It's not the easiest job in the world. Really isn't.
No, it sounds very intense. Speaking of how you kind of use your voice as an instrument, firstly, I get that you have to kind of keep your voice so safe. It's very theatre. But
as we both,
ex-theatre kids ourselves. So let's talk about voice modulation. So whether it's natural or deliberate on part of the commentator, sports commentary asks you to be very tonal, and you have to modulate your voice to fit the ups and downs of the game. Was this a learned skill, and how do you go about doing that?
100%. 100%, and it has to be deliberate. I was a commentator when I started out, 15 years old, first game, very, very impressionable. So always trying to match the high moments, and you talk very quickly. It's like a wave. You've got to be up and down with the moment. Like, if there's a goal in the last minute that changes the complexion of two teams' seasons, you've got to match it. But if it's 7-0, and a team scores to make it 7-1 in the 95th minute of a game, you're not going to go at it in the same manner. And you kind of have to go up and down, because if you're up all the time, you don't have another gear to go to. Whereas if you're up and down, you can reach that gear and hit that massive moment right at the top at the end of the game. You can hit that moment and give it the justice it deserves, while also giving an enjoyable listener experience. Because if you're yelling at the top of your voice for 105 minutes during moments that don't really matter, it feels quite in your face. It is something you're taught. It is something you have to learn very quickly. And the very best commentators are the ones that do it well.
I'm currently going through voice coaching at the moment, trying to get my presenting to where it needs to be, and it's hard.
It is.
It's so much harder than you think it's going to be. I talk all the time. She'll be right. I'll talk all the time. No, it's so much harder than you possibly think, because you are so conscious of how your mouth is moving, and it's very weird.
It is. It's strange.
No, I didn't realize that it was that much thinking involved in it. The way you described keeping it at the ups and keeping it at the downs, I had no idea that it took so much.
Yeah, well, now that I've kind of said it, next time you listen to a sports broadcaster, you'll see straight away, you'll be like, that's what he meant. And again, that was something that I had to grapple with as well. I sort of knew that commentators went up and down before I started commentating, but then I couldn't quite replicate it. It took me a while to replicate it. It is a real skill, and I had to develop it and get better at it.
Do you think sports journalism is excluded or included when we talk about the fourth estate?
Oh, absolutely, it's included.
Amazing.
Absolutely.
It's in the name, right? It's sports journalism.
Sports journalism certainly is. The point I was making before about Australia being so culturally invested into sport is it's always going to have a place. Even more so now with what's happened at the Women's World Cup recently. Now we've got more eyes on it. We've had the Matildas sell out 12 home games in a row. Now there's a different audience of people who want to care about sports, and that's amazing. It's part of the fourth estate because it is journalism. Commentary, in its purest form, is journalism because you're reporting on what's going on.
You keep bringing up the Tildas because, of course, they're iconic. What was the popularity that came with the Matildas' success? What did that mean for sports journalism and Australian sports journalism?
It meant a hell of a lot. Well, particularly for Australian football, because not only did we have a whole different group of fans who wanted to watch sport, which in itself is amazing, we had the centre of the universe in that 4-week time period being football. I hadn't felt like that since I was living in England. When the Matildas knocked out France, and it's the first story in the bulletin, by the way, that was insane. That penalty shootout was incredible. My nerves were going through the roof. I wasn't even born an Aussie and I was riding every kick of the ball. That was the main news story. Everywhere you looked, that was the front page. And that was so important, not only for football but for media in general, because it just shows what sport can do. I think Australia is a country that knows exactly what sport can do. We've seen Cathy Freeman, we've seen Stephen Bradbury, for example, being icons now of Australian sport. And now the Matildas, you've got young lads with Sam Kerr jerseys and Hayley Rasso jerseys. That is the legacy. The World Cup is going to leave. We're going to have so many people caring about sport, and that's why it's so special. And I think that's why football's so special as well.
And I think something that was really special about it, not to get on my feminist high horse again, but it was women's sport. We have not seen women's sport that highly publicised ever. To have more people watching the Matildas play than they ever have watching a grand final is insane. And to just absolutely commend the work of the Matildas to get that attention was so important. And the amount of young girls who picked up soccer and sport and felt like they had a place, that representation that we were talking about earlier, was really rife in that moment.
Do you reckon if we didn't have the home World Cup, do you reckon the Matildas would have sold out 12 home games in a row?
Not
a chance. And that is by no means to belittle the wonderful work they do anyway, but it just shows that once you put it on a platform, there's people that are going to come and watch it.
So we asked you to bring in a piece of journalism that you really enjoyed, and you sent us this piece called Not on Facebook, You're Still Likely Being Fed Misinformation by Nicholas A. Ashford, who is an MIT professor, and this piece was published in New York Times. Decades ago, long before there was a technology industry to regulate, the Federal Communications Commission instituted the Fairness Doctrine, a policy that required broadcasters to present diverse points of view on controversial topics. Ashford goes on to write, individuals gravitate towards news sources that reinforce their prior impressions, values, and opinions. Exposing people to more balanced sources might help expand their perspectives, but science tells us that this can also serve to strengthen current beliefs. Okay, so this is a piece that talks about misinformation and fake news and how that's affecting us and what we can possibly do to combat that. What drew your attention to this piece?
Fake news and misinformation, disinformation is something that absolutely fascinates me. It absolutely terrifies me in some other ways as a budding journalist and broadcaster. It talks about fake news, and we've seen so many instances of fake news, and as journalists, we now not only have to decipher between what's right and what's wrong, but we also have to write what's right and not write what's wrong, because if you do that, then there's some legal cases and there's some gavels that are going to get brought down.
I think it's interesting. We all kind of are at the same age group and grew up thinking about journalism as fake news kind of began its trajectory, like around 2016.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you can't really comment on before or after, but how do you believe that it's kind of changed the industry?
Anything sort of pre-2016, I didn't really have a whole grasp on. And then, of course, there was a lot of fake news talk surrounding the 2016 US presidential election. There was a class here at RMIT that I had to take where, we were basically looking at misinformation, disinformation, and trying to find the coolest pieces of disinformation. But it's scary because some people that are unacquainted and maybe not so journalism savvy might click on something and go, oh my goodness, this is happening to the world, when actually some people might go, it's just fake news.
Yeah, it's really hard when it's like, people are getting their news from TikToks and the internet. I read it on the internet and therefore it's true.
The thing about that article that sort of struck me is again, it talks about the first few words of the title, not on Facebook. You're still getting fed fake news, or, to paraphrase. That gets taken away from the screen and gets brought into normal conversation. Like, that's scary when you put it like that.
It is a really scary notion. And how do we deal with the loss of faith that comes with fake news in journalism? The article says public trust in the media industry has been declining for years.
To be honest, as people who are in the journalism space or wanted to be in the journalism space, you speak to certain people and they go, why would you want to be a journalist?
My auntie at Christmas, I told her I got a job as a journalist. She goes, why would you want to be that? And I was like, I've just been studying it for the last 4 years and it's what I'm passionate about. My mum literally told her to fuck off, so...
Well, that's some way to do it. You see on Twitter sometimes all this stuff about journalists being untrustworthy to a group of people. To build that trust up, again, you can only control what you can control. So on an individual level, you've got to make sure that you become a trustworthy one and you're a part of the next wave of journalists who are trustworthy. I think the fact that we've seen fake news, a rise of fake news, should make journalists really, really careful. Our wave of journalists, if you like, that are starting to break through now, we're afraid of the consequences of fake news and getting it wrong.
And I think that's kind of drilled into us now too.
Yeah.
Fact-checking has become one of the 5 pillars, which is interesting.
Yeah. bringing into this though, actually, I came across this news app recently called Ground News. Have either of you heard of it?
No.
I haven't, no.
Okay, so Ground News is this website. They have analyzed a lot of international news sources, and then they have put them in, are they liberal, are they conservative, are they moderate? And then they give you the news headline from different news websites and different newspapers, all in the same go, and they tell you if they're more liberal, more left, or more right, or conservative. And they also do a fact check on them.
What a tool.
Guys, get on the app. Free promotion over there.
Yeah, I was going to say, did we finally get ads?
Is this where a disclaimer comes in?
Unfortunately, we're not being sponsored by them, but
to clear up.
this is to say that we actually have sources coming up where we can check things, and at the end, it just comes down to education. If you want to combat misinformation, you got to get educated.
There's a real power leaving people uneducated, and I think this piece kind of highlights that. Written by the New York Times, is set in the American journalism landscape and talks about freedom of speech and the fairness doctrine brought in by Ronald Reagan. But it also talks about misinformation on social media, which is a very present issue in Australia. Reflecting on this piece, how do you view the current state of Australian journalism? Can it be trusted?
At some point, there has to be a level of trust, because we've got some incredible journalists who are on the ground telling people what they need to know. Less and less people now watch the 6 o'clock news. Could you imagine where the world would be without the 6 o'clock news, without people breaking news? There'd be a lot of unrest and uneasiness, and that wouldn't be great for anybody. I think there will always be a certain level of trust.
Where do you see the future of journalism?
The fact that I'm going to say that I have no idea where we're heading is testament to where we're going. I think a lot of it will become more digital. We've already seen not the full phasing out of hard copy papers, but how people prefer to then log on to their Apple News to get their sorts of news. I think that's only going to grow stronger and stronger, which will probably phase out, maybe not completely, but phase out newsrooms to a point, which I wouldn't be a massive fan of, but we also have to be embracing of change. I'm really interested to see what happens. I hope that we can still do our jobs and that it's not just automated robots doing it all for us, but let's see, it's going to be a lot of fun to find out.
Isn't it just? I think there's something about journalism that needs to be human, and I hope to anything above that we really learn to value that human element, because AI cannot provide that.
No.
AI can't chat around a table, talk about journalism.
That's the whole essence of what life is. Because, not to get too existential, the best parts of life are the human elements, where you can interact with a person. I saw something this morning at a football match where there was a 98-year-old fan with dementia who was losing touch with his people, but his club anthem was playing and he got up and started singing it. A robot's not replicating that. At the end of the day, journalists have to represent what's going on in the wider world, and we're all people, and there has to be a human element to that, and that's where I hope it stays.
Amazing. Well, we have discussed the state of the fourth estate. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ollie.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yay!
The State of the Fourth Estate podcast is co-produced by Sura, Mishra and Tayla Oates. Music by Wessa, branding by Lee Barkey, and social content by Yarrah Muneer.